Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel, Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. You might be able to see some of it behind me, it's tropical houseplants. So do you want to geek out a bit with me today and learn a few more of the scientific terms for the hobby that we all love so much? This is obviously going to be a continuation of a previous series of videos that I've done, and I will link it up at the top there. And today I want to dive into a few more elements, essentially, of kind of looking at what we deal with our houseplants in a more scientific way, looking at some of the terms, looking at why plants will do certain things. And the things that we're going to be covering today are things like what is pubescence in plants? What is a plant that is an epiphytic plant or a terrestrial plant? What is an inflorescence? What part of that inflorescence is the Spadix, and what is the Spathe, and what both of those things are, and what kind of function do they both serve? We dive into scientific names, and a few people kind of corrected a few mistakes that I made on my wishlist plant, and it was my own fault for getting a bit complacent on how I was naming a few things, but I thought it might be a good idea to discuss it as a group, essentially. And then I want to touch base just slightly after we talk about naming on something that you might have seen on a few plants, the example being the Monstera spa Peru, SP Peru. And we'll look at what the spa means at the end of the video. And as always, I'll close up with some of my own thoughts and conclusions. And yeah, let's dive into the first topic. So the first thing I want to talk about is pubescence. And pubescence is something that I do personally quite like on my plants. It might not be for everyone. This might be another one of those Marmite situations, at least people that know what Marmite is. So it's either you love it or you hate it, but there is a purpose for it. Now, what is pubescence? Pubescence is when you get hair-like structures, and it's not actually hair. So hair-like structures either on the stem, you can get it on the petiole of the leaf, you can get it on the leaf itself, and essentially it just makes whatever structure it is on the plant look slightly hairy. Now this can be really, really dense, and I'm trying to think of a house plant that is not coming to mind at the moment that is entirely covered in hair. It will probably come to me and I will kick myself whilst I'm editing this video, but I know of a garden plant, so I think its common name is lamb's ears. And anybody who's experienced it, it literally looks like it has got a fur coat on top of its leaves. Actually, no, I do remember now. One of the plants that is technically a bit of a garden plant, but I have grown it indoors as well, is the Senecio angel wings. And if I'm not mistaken, it also won a Royal Horticultural Society or even Chelsea award a few years back. If you do ever have a chance to come across one of these plants, either in, I would say probably the easiest place that you're probably going to find them would be something like a plant nursery or a garden center. Do please go and touch the leaves and thank me later, because think of the softest kind of teddy bear that you might have had as a kid, and that just really fine fuzz. It is like, I don't know how else to describe it. This is going to be a weird section of the video because I quite like hairy plants and I quite like kind of stroking them to feel them as well. But the angel wings Senecio is very similar to when you get new puppy ears and you get that really, really soft kind of fur that you get there. Anyway, sorry, random weird moment with like hairy puppy ears. You thought you were watching a video about plants, I'm sorry. But essentially, when it comes to pubescence, and essentially it's what I was talking about, it looks a bit like hair-like structures. It's actually not hair, it is a cell type essentially that is called trichomes. And I think it's a cell type. If there's any scientists out there and I'm getting that a bit wrong, I was trying to find exactly what it is. I think it's a cell structure essentially called a trichome. And it's interesting, again, I'll throw in some of the random pub quiz knowledge that you might find interesting. Trichome, or trija, in Greek literally means hair. So trichomes, to me, easily kind of translates as something that's a hair-like structure, essentially. But you might ask yourself, why do some plants have this and why do certain other plants not? And I can definitely kind of talk a bit more about the plants that do have this pubescence, this fuzziness on the leaves. It is because essentially what it does several things, at least from what I was able to see from some of the scientific articles out there. One is it creates, however much you might find this surprising, especially if a plant has only got quite sparse hair-like structures, it creates a tiny bit of shade. Obviously, if it's got a lot of hair-like structures like the lamb's ear that we were talking about before, it does really create quite a bit of shade on the leaves. And that would mean that it's quite adept. A lot of the times they're quite adept to slightly, especially if it's covered in hair, it's quite adept to growing in very dry conditions. And I'll come back to the dry in a minute. Very bright and very hot conditions. Because the other thing that the scientist thinks that these trichomes or this pubescence helps with the plants is it actually helps reduce the water that is lost from their leaves during transpiration, and that's during the process of the plant actually breathing, essentially. So it kind of helps to keep some of that moisture in and not lose some of it. So really interestingly, at least here in the UK, and I know a lot of parts around the world, at least in the southern hemisphere, have had a lot of heat waves recently. And that's been like scorching sun all day long and also blistering heat and not very much water. And what that has generally meant is that a lot of the plants out in the gardens, out in the fields have died off. Interestingly, have a look at the plants that have survived this, possibly even thrived. And one that really does come to mind, which I'm also highly allergic to, is lavender. And if you look at the lavender plant, it might not be abundantly clear to you in the very beginning, but if I'm not mistaken, on a kind of more cellular, I don't want to say cellular level, but on a deeper level, because it's not quite as obvious, the leaves, if I'm not mistaken, are covered in a very fine form of pubescence. I might be wrong about this, I'll correct myself if I am, but I think I'm right. And that has meant that these plants generally don't tend to flinch too much about those types of conditions. Apologies, just as I was talking about heat waves, it has now decided to rain and the heavens have opened and I'm in the conservatory. I'm really hoping that you won't hear pitter-patter. If you do, I will try to remove as much of it as possible in editing. But moving on swiftly, what you want to maybe have a think of is if your plant is densely covered in hair, that might give you a bit of an indication as to where it would grow naturally. So maybe somewhere that gets a lot of light, a lot of heat, and all these things. Try to replicate that for your plant. Moving on to the topic of what is a plant that is epiphytic, because a lot of the plants that we have in our collections, especially at home, most of the house plants that tend to be climbing or even trailing, because a lot of the times the trailing plants are actually climbing plants in nature, are epiphytic. And you can see one of them is behind me. So for instance, this would be an example. So my Philodendron esmeraldens is an epiphytic plant. The Monstera deliciosa is an epiphytic plant as well. The pothos, the common pothos, is an epiphytic plant. And generally what I mean by epiphytic, these are plants that need something like a tree, and we talked about this in some of my other videos, to climb up, and it gives them support and structure so they can climb up to get closer to the light so they can grow, basically, because they don't necessarily have that rigidity in them to kind of grow like, for instance, a tree might do. And essentially, again, this is linking back to possibly where it got its name. Epi, in ancient Greek, epi means upon, basically. So it's something that would grow upon something else. So something like a monstera using a tree to climb upon it to reach higher up towards the light. Now, the interesting thing with this, and a lot of people might kind of have heard of a different term, which is parasitic, which generally means it's something that might grow on a tree, for instance, or on something else that is a parasite. So essentially, it supports itself and it grows at the detriment of the thing that it's attached to. So for instance, if some of these plants were parasitic to the trees that they were growing on, they would attach to the tree and they would leach the nutrients from the tree, slowly killing the host, which would be the tree, in order for them to survive. Epiphytic plants generally will not do this. And I say generally because there are moments, and you can see this probably if you see some of these plants in the wild, where if an epiphytic plant is really aggressive and it grows around a specific tree in order to reach up, there is a chance that potential epiphytic plant might end up toppling the tree down, which is not going to just cause a problem for the tree, it's also going to cause a problem for the epiphytic plant as well. But yeah, they can get really heavy, they can kind of pull on the tree. It could potentially suffocate the tree, dependingly, essentially. But yeah, epiphytic plants aren't anything to necessarily be scary of. They're not like parasitic, as I've just mentioned. But it's a really interesting thing to remember, because if a lot of the plants are epiphytics, they do kind of need, it's in their nature, they need that thing to climb up. Usually a tree. In most of the household environments, it might be janky support sticks for the win. Or it could also be things like moss poles, planks, all these things. And even for the brave few that will let some of their plants climb up their walls, I do envy you and I would love to do that with my house. I just don't want to take half the plaster off my walls when it comes to potentially removing that plant. But yeah, let's move on to the next topic. So closely related is terrestrial, and terrestrial plants are kind of what we would call in a lot of the tropical plant collections, the scramblers, the crawlers, all of these plants. So I'm thinking things like the Plougmanii, if I'm not mistaken. There's a lot of debate about whether or not the Plougmanii is actually a crawler or a climber. The Pastazanum, the Philodendron gloriosum, a lot of these plants are terrestrial plants, so they will grow in soil essentially. So with the epiphytic, they don't always need soil to grow in. They can grow in little pockets on the tree as well if there's enough material for the roots to go in. They're not very heavy on the root side of things. With most terrestrial plants, and it's not always the case, but with most of them, they will have more kind of traditional roots that will grow in the soil as well. Obviously, you still need to remember that these are tropical plants, so the soil that you're thinking of, I'm thinking of where I am now in the UK, that might be quite boggy and wet for most of the time, and it doesn't have an awful lot of aeration naturally occurring. They probably won't do as well as they might do on the jungle floor, where there's a lot of leaf debris and a lot of other things on the floor of and within that soil there. So they're used to slightly more airy soil, but they are still kind of ground dwelling. And this means that these plants, instead of growing up, might, like what the kind of the term that we all use, which is the scramblers and the crawlers, they crawl along the surface of the soil and they release their roots within the soil itself. You can kind of think of it as a flip side of what the epiphytic is. So the epiphytic are using the trees to kind of climb up the side, whilst if it's on the ground, it's using the soil level as that support and then pushing the leaves up. The thing that you will get with a lot of the terrestrial and more kind of ground-dwelling plants is usually they do have an ultimate height that they will only be able to reach because the petioles will only stretch that much. And that's kind of as far as they'll go with the epiphytic plants, because they can use those trees. Ultimately, they can grow as tall as the tree is. So something to bear in mind there. Moving on to inflorescences. And essentially, it is just a more scientific word of describing something that is a flower or a bloom of a specific plant. But generally speaking, if you're talking about most houseplants that tend to be within the aroid or Araceae family, they will get inflorescences, basically. To be fair, I think an inflorescence is a general term that you can describe most types of blooms or flowers. It just depends on what people are used to using. But theoretically and more kind of properly within what we do, which is more of the tropical houseplants, you should really be calling it an inflorescence. And I think a lot of people do, generally speaking, because it means a whole host of things, because it's not just the traditional bloom that you might get with the petals and the stamens and all of these things. A lot of the times, especially for aroids, an inflorescence usually will have a spadix and a spathe. And that's the topic that I want to dive into now. So looking at the spadix more specifically, this is the part of the bloom or the inflorescence that is the bit that sticks out, essentially. So it's where you would get all the pollen being deposited on. And actually something that you might not know about the spadix is that that entire thing, so I'm thinking if you'd look at the traditional kind of very ornamental anthuriums that are bought for the colourful inflorescences, and I'll come to that in just a second, you'll see that yellow bit that's sticking out in the middle. And you would assume, okay, so some people know that part of it is actually the bloom. However, it goes a bit deeper than that, because that yellow section of the inflorescence isn't the bloom. Within that structure, within that yellow structure, every single little element on there that could be producing what you might be using as pollen to pollinate for your anthuriums, that is individual tiny, 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 tiny blooms. So that's an interesting thing to remember, is that one thing, that yellow thing isn't, there's probably a better word for me, that structure, that's the word, that structure, that yellow or orange structure, doesn't always have to be, sometimes be green as well, that structure itself isn't the bloom. What is on it is all the little tiny blooms. So that's a really interesting thing, at least I find it really kind of eye-opening, essentially. But moving on to the spathe, and the spathe, coming back to what I was just talking about before with the really ornamental anthuriums, where you get those kind of bright reds, or even whites sometime, I think, as well. That is the spathe, and essentially it is a specific type of leaf that is different from the other leaves within the plants a lot of the time, and generally if you get it to be highly, highly colourful, and you can probably see where I'm going with this, it's because that leaf is there to attract, by using those bright colors, is there to attract the pollinators. And the pollinators get attracted to this spathe, and that then brings them closer to that structure that has the part of the inflorescence that does have all the blooms on it. So the spadix that we were talking about before. So I think that is fascinating, because it's different parts of that inflorescence are working essentially in harmony to be able to create the best scenario for that inflorescence to get pollinated, and essentially for that plant to pass on its genetic material and essentially have progeny through seeds that might be produced somewhere else. Because that's essentially what these structures are doing, is they're trying to attract the pollinators to pass on the genetic material. Now moving on to scientific names. And as I mentioned earlier on in the video, the reason why I wanted to include this is, very rightly so, I got called out by one of my followers, and who'd kind of mentioned, who just like, loved the video, but you kind of didn't use the correct way of presenting the scientific names of the plants. And they were entirely correct. And it was just me being a bit complacent. I was doing this months or even years ago, but I kind of fell into bad habits. But I want to correct them, and I will try to do better. But I thought, let's discuss this, because I don't know whether or not a lot of people are even aware that there is a correct scientific way of writing botanical names. So a lot of the times you might get something like Monstera, and I'll use the example of Monstera deliciosa, so Monstera deliciosa. Now, the correct way that is accepted by most scientists in how you would present that is Monstera is the genus and deliciosa is the species. So what you want to be doing there is, in an ideal world, the entire name would be italicized. And the genus would be the one that would have the first letter as a capital. So the M in Monstera would be a capital M. And then the Deliciosa, the first letter on the word will never be a capital. So it all needs to be lowercase. So Deliciosa will not have a capital D in front of it. And that is the correct scientific way of presenting these names. If I'm not mistaken, again, I've had to go back and refresh my memory through different articles that I found online. If there are scientists out there and I'm talking rubbish again, do let me know, because I sometimes have seen that only the species needs to be italicized. It's less important to do that for the genus, but I'm going to go with the fact that italicize both. And this also makes sense when you abbreviate certain scientific plant names. So for instance, if you do Monstera deliciosa, you could do capital M full stop deliciosa. That D will still be small there at that point, by the way. So it's just the correct way, or the correct and accepted way within the scientific community to describe botanical names. Expanding slightly on that, when we look at things like hybrids. So for instance, you might get this with a lot of Anthurium hybrids, and some people might be aware, some people might not be aware. Usually what you would do is you would list both of the parent plants fully, so both the genus and the species. So it might be something like Anthurium warwickii, or the Queen Anthurium, X, and you would put an X between the second parent of the plant, so what you've crossed it with. So for instance, it might be Anthurium forgetii. So you would have Anthurium warwickii X Anthurium forgetii, and that is a hybrid. It's basically telling you that that is a hybrid of those two plants. The reason why you do this is because those types of hybrids aren't necessarily classed as a new plant. So you do need to present them, at least to be correct scientifically, in that manner. Whether or not there is a plant that you put first and which one you put second, I didn't find anything. I might be wrong, and I'll correct myself up here because I might do a bit more research when I'm editing this as to which one, if there's a preference as to which one goes first. I don't think there is, as long as you've got both parents' plants that the hybrids are created from listed. Sometimes, however, you might get some hybrids that might have more commercial names. And I'm trying to think of one at the moment, and it's kind of eluding me. But sometimes you'll get these crosses and they will get given a bit of a commercial name from the person that hybridized them. And those plants might also be known by that as well. But I think the correct way to describe these crosses between two different species is with that X in between. One little thing that I want to add here is when you're looking at things like trade names or kind of commercial names, again, is a lot of the times, and some people might be aware of this, some people might not be aware of this, is that there are certain plants that might be hybrids or might even be kind of essentially grown and cross-pollinated with preferable, it might be the same species, it might not even be cross-pollination, it might just be bred through kind of mixing genetics of the same species of plant to get desired elements within that plant. So for instance, if you know that, and this has been done for years with a lot of the agricultural plants out there. So for instance, I'll give you an example with that because that's going to be an easier one for I think most people to kind of wrap their heads around. If people know that there's a specific type of tomato that does really well against blight, the manufacturer or the grower that might be growing a commercial name plant to this would probably breed this plant to be resistant to blight or to be resistant to pests. With houseplants, a lot of times that there will be plants that will be kind of grown and essentially selected to have specific features. So it might be more variegation sometimes, it might be more stable variegation, it might be specific coloration, it might be more hardiness to lower humidity levels as well. So this is another thing as well. If a plant has been on the market for many, many years, it's had chance through all these different growers to become more robust to being in a standard household environment. And that's sometimes why you see with some of these rarer house plants, they are trickier, not always, they are trickier to care for in a standard household environment because they've not had decades of kind of people growing them for those specific traits, which would make them hardier for a home environment rather than being out in nature within their native environment. So in situations like that, you will get something like a commercial name, and that commercial name can be capitalized. It can sometimes have the TM, so the trademarked or the OR. And a lot of the times, plants that have got commercial names, not common names, and it can get a bit muddy at times, basically, with this one. Usually you can tell when something is a commercial name and not just a common name. So I'm thinking of if we think about the pothos plant, so the golden pothos, even the name golden pothos is a common name. I don't think it's a commercial name. It might have been a commercial name many, many years ago, and it has since become a common name. But the pothos plant, for instance, or the devil's ivy. So the devil's ivy is something that would probably be a common name instead of a commercial name. But yeah, that's a bit more about the kind of correct way of scientifically presenting botanical names. And to wrap it up, I want to touch a bit on the SPA or the .sp. Again, I'll use the same example. So Monstera spa Peru, that SP means species. And it generally what it will mean is that that is a plant that hasn't been described yet. So the scientists haven't gone in to try and match its inflorescence to something else to see where it would fit in, or they haven't done the DNA testing in order to attach a name to it as well. This is generally a bit of a sticky topic because, so for instance, Monstera spa Peru, a lot of the times when you see the spa, the next word that will follow it is the location where this plant has been discovered. And that's the sticky topic there, because there is, rightly so, there is a lot of debate going on about this at the moment of just like, are these plants actually discovered by the slightly arrogant scientists that have just like, I've discovered this plant, where they've been a native plant that's been growing there for hundreds of years and all the locals know this plant and they named this plant something else. It's a sticky topic, but yeah, it hasn't been described scientifically. That's what the SP stands for. So in conclusion, and hopefully I have not bored you, but I think generally people, from the feedback that I've been getting from these slightly more geeky, more scientific videos, I think most people enjoy this as well, just to kind of do a bit of a deeper dive. This isn't for somebody that's necessarily starting off, not to say that this might not be of interest to you if you are starting off, but yeah, there is a lot to consider, and a lot of the times knowing some of these scientific names, so like think about what we were talking about when we were looking at the pubescence and what we learned there about the fact that they can withstand high light levels and very dry conditions and all of these things. That gives you a bit of an indication. The plant itself, the way that it's structured, is giving you an indication of possibly what its care that it prefers will be. Same thing about learning about the inflorescence and about the multiple blooms and what the spathe does in terms of like attracting the pollinators. Evolution for all of these plants is mind-blowing to me. I find it really, really interesting because it's how these plants have evolved in their environment and within their condition and how they're growing or what they're trying to achieve. Like for instance, the spathe being really colorful to get the pollinators in order to survive. And not just survive, but just to pass on their genetic material and have more progeny, essentially. It is fascinating. But yeah, do let me know if you like these types of videos and you want more of these. There is an infinite amount of scientific knowledge that we can kind of sit there and discuss. And as always with all my videos, I do suggest that, and I think a lot of my followers do like to geek out a bit on this, and they've got insanely good scientific knowledge as well. Have conversations down below, because science is always evolving, and it's always a part of having that debate and experimentation and all of these things. Is why I used to love sciences when I was going down that route in my life. I'm not anymore in that route of my life, but yeah, it is fascinating. So yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon, and I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.